Welcome to the Gritiron Show with Whitney Bro, a weekly podcast where we celebrate the perseverance, passion, and lifestyle of women on and off the field. The Gritiron Show with Whitney Bro is a part of the CJC Media Network.
Welcome back to the Gritiron Show. Hope you're having a great day and a great week. We're here with another amazing woman with grit. It's Dr. LaKeitha Poole, Director of Student Athlete Mental Health at LSU Athletics, and also the Director of Sports Performance at Small Talk Counseling and Consulting, here to tell us a little bit more about mental health for our student athletes and for our young kids. Please help me welcome to the show, Dr. LaKeitha Poole. How you doing, Doc?
I'm good, Whitney. How are you?
Doing good. We can't say a big enough thank you for saying yes to joining us on the Gritiron Show. This is such an important topic, mental health. I know that it's been at the forefront of so many conversations, especially around athletics. So we're so excited to have you on today to kind of share your perspective, your professional opinion with our listeners, and obviously the moms and dads, and even maybe some of the student athletes themselves that are out there. So thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I'm excited.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right in. I mean, obviously, like I said before, mental health is an important conversation. It's one that we're seeing more and more at the forefront. What do you think is driving an increase in the conversation around mental health as it relates to athletes?
I think, just the progression of it as a topic has come from, a place where now we're seeing so many more athletes, both at the pro level, collegiately, and beyond, in youth sports as well. People just being much more willing to be more vocal about it being an important topic, but also it being just as important as physical health. And so what we've seen is this huge, kind of push for people to consider the other ways in which you can improve as an athlete. And that not only includes getting physical treatment, medical treatment, taking care of your bodies, eating right, but also how you're treating your brain and how you're taking care of your wellness and your well-being overall. So it's been pretty cool to watch that evolution happen when there was once a time where people weren't so willing to share their difficulties around their mental health, particularly as an athlete, because they're taught to persevere, to push through, to be tougher, stronger, faster, smarter, and you can still be all those things and still have struggles. And so it's just been kind of like a breath of fresh air, really, for people to be much more open to the process of thinking about your health in a broader perspective.
And like you said, I mean, it's whole body health. And if you're going to excel at your game or even as, a professional, a working professional, there's more than just, like you said, taking care of your body. What do you think is maybe some of the barriers that, whether it's students or even parents, that they might face in trying to address mental health as possibly a challenge? But again, being that it is a part of kind of your whole body wellness, what are some of those challenges that you oftentimes see student athletes face in trying to come to terms with saying, you know what, this is something that I need to talk with someone more about. This is something that I need to address in order for me to be my best self?
Mm-hmm. I think it looks different at different levels, but for sure, the idea of even the stigma originally that was there, like we just talked about, that's kind of, it's fading little by little, but the stigma around it, you might have an athlete who's really into thinking about their mental wellness and sport performance being interconnected. But maybe their parents who might be, we might call them just a little bit more old school, where it's kind of like, you want to push through whatever difficulties you have, knowing that your skill and your ability as an athlete is the thing that maybe wins you a game or a meet or whatever. But at the end of the day, being able to sort of erase the stigma around getting support is really at the core of that. I think sometimes when it comes to the challenges or the struggles, I think then when you look at collegiate sports or even youth sports, everyone doesn't have an area like ours at LSU. So every school doesn't have, your counseling staff be skilled in sport performance and mental performance and sport counseling. That is just not the case. So it's unique to have that. And so, I will say more at the university level, they're getting more staff in those areas. But for youth sports, that's still pretty new. And so a lot of those folks may have to go see someone in private practice separately, kind of like I have a separate practice where I do that. It's being able to find those folks and there's not a ton in every area because it is something that's still evolving. And a lot of times you don't necessarily have access the same way people wouldn't have access to general medical care. Getting mental health treatment is still a medical service. And so whether or not it's covered by your insurance or those sort of things sometimes come into play as well. So it depends on the level, but I mean, the challenges can be the same. It's all about access, all about that stigma maybe being in place, and then being able to then know that these services even exist for student athletes to even take advantage of.
Absolutely. And I mean, we were talking before. I mean, I'm a mom. I've got a sixth grader who's playing 3 different sports right now. And, you know, it feels like the pressure on young kids, I mean, young athletes these days, I mean, it's enormous, you know, because of the promises of what comes, you know, beyond high school and then into college and then into the pros. I mean, when you think about younger students that are involved in athletics and young, you know, athletes, I mean, at what age do you typically begin to possibly see them in your private practice? And what are some of maybe the unique challenges that you see younger athletes face versus maybe some of your collegiate athletes?
Yeah. So, you know, I think as early as even like that 8, 9, and 10 range, that's an option for someone if they're interested in like being able to help make sure that a young athlete, we call it youth sports, but like you can, you know, there can be some identity development concerns that can come up in knowing that, just like you mentioned, you know, there's a lot of promise at the end of some of those collegiate careers or even before that, depending on the sport. And so there's a lot of pressure that comes with developing yourself as just a young person and as an individual. And then an athletic identity comes alongside of that. And so at that age, you know, some of those like park league ages and things like that, it can be really difficult to try to navigate the line between like enjoying this and having fun and developing your skills so that if you are interested in playing, you know, in middle and high school and college, that you can do that because there's so many other logistics related to that. But in some cases, the fun part gets taken out of it. And so you see folks who will tell you they started playing their sport at, you know, 5 and 6 years old, get to high school and college, and they're kind of like, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore, you know, and most times they sort of have to work through that because they actually do want to do their sport, but they've hit almost like a burnout because they haven't necessarily fully developed maybe their individual identity. And then the closer you get to sort of exiting that high school, college level and not knowing what's going to be next, it's scary. And so that's where you see sort of the mental health piece play in of like, well, did I do enough? Or, you know, what happens if I don't have a backup plan around my sport and what does that look like? And so from that level at that age, it's just really important to make sure you're developing both of those, which is kind of what is cool and I love about, you know, my role in my private practice is getting to do that with youth sports because there's really, again, not like a space for that in their schools. There's just not that staff person really available. It's not there yet. It's not as common. I think collegiately, you see some of the same things, but this is the opposite end of the spectrum, right? It's those folks that maybe either they started out playing really young or maybe they didn't. And there is still that promise of like what's ahead. And so you have everything from your sports like, you know, men's and women's basketball or football, where there is an opportunity to compete at the pro level or even tennis or golf. But then you have sports like gymnastics or swimming and diving that really, unless maybe you're making like a Team USA, there's not really a pro level for that. And so, you know, what does that then mean as you start thinking about whether that's a transition out of sport, as well as just your general identity once sport maybe looks different. And so many of those athletes may go on to be coaches or coaching staff or even administrators at universities helping, you know, future athletes, but it's a lot to manage. And so just being able to kind of be aware of that general identity development being key at whatever age, I think is really important.
Now, I want to double click into identity development because myself as like a working professional in corporate America, it's something that we talk a little bit about when we talk about like building your personal brand and you know, what are your strengths and how do you kind of, you know, lean into what you're good at. Now in the context though of mental health and especially around the athletic space, how do you define identity development? And then what all goes into helping an athlete better understand and develop their personal identity?
Yeah, so you really have to have a person-centered approach. And so when we talk about identity development, when we say identity, we mean sort of a holistic idea of who that person is in all areas. So, I mean everything from values to character to, the things that maybe each of us pick up that's unique based on our parents' background or our upbringing, which could be, your cultural and racial identity development. That could be based on spirituality, religion, that could be based on even class in a way of understanding like the way in which the world works and how you navigate finances and managing money. It's all the things that on a day-to-day basis, most of us, in the workforce are thinking about all the time because we have to. But like at the end of the day, those are areas that get touched by sport in some form, whether that person goes on to play, collegiately or at the pro level. And I mean, collegiately, we can probably start talking about with some of those areas as well, because the name, image, likeness stuff that's about to trickle down a lot from AA, that's coming out. And so, kids now are going to have to think differently about how do they manage, just like you were talking about, even personal brands. That's not something that in most cases, when you think about your identity, you're usually thinking about the things that come more naturally. Like we said, those values, those character traits. When you're talking about promoting yourself now as a brand, what does that look like? Is that authentically you? And so when we're talking about that, we're really hoping that we're developing the core of a person so that they can still make decisions and they can grow and change, but that the core of who they are as an individual and what they hold dear to them, whether that's, people, places, things, I always say, those things need to stay true in order for you to actually feel like you're evolving in your sport, but actually getting out of it what you're putting into it. And so it definitely is a lifelong process, because even well after people in sport, most people who are athletes or former athletes kind of always identify in that way. I'm technically a former athlete, and I always think of my days of playing volleyball track, but I know I can't do it today. And so it makes you wonder, where does that fit into my growth and development to then end up in mental health and those connections that you make? So when we're talking about identity, we mean the core of a person really related to who they are, that's a little more unchanging in spite of whatever their external circumstances might be.
Wow. And that's important. Like I said, that's important for any person, but especially when we think about athletes and student athletes that are put into, as I like to say, the arena of the most intense competition in some cases that we see in our society. That individual development is key. And you mentioned burnout, and it's something that I've been asked a lot about. And, Whitney, how do you not burn out? And I don't always have the best answer for it, but what are maybe some techniques or some approaches that you recommend for maybe parents that are out there, or as I said before, student athletes, or as I even like to say, the ancient athletes that are still trying to hang in there? Yeah. When they start to feel, what does burnout feel like in your expert opinion? And what are some things that people can do to try to address it?
Yeah, I definitely think that burnout is something that happens across the board, whether you are, currently active as an athlete, or, and I love that phrase, ancient athletes. I love that. I think of knowing that, at a certain point, all of us we're human. And so our bodies have so much of a capacity, and burnout is typically defined as when that capacity that we have physically and mentally is superseded or exceeded. And so being able to recognize that comes with different signs in different people. So for some folks, burnout, as an athlete may be that they no longer feel interested in their sport, or they're having a hard time like recouping and gaining energy again every day when they have practice and kind of pushing through in that way. For others, it may be that they have personality shifts in the sense of like being more irritable around their sport when they're playing, and maybe more aggressive or less, more passive, maybe less aggressive than they normally would be. And so any sort of subtle changes doesn't necessarily mean they've hit that burnout wall yet, but that it could be a sign of something approaching, particularly if other folks around them notice, that your athlete's not quite the same. Or if you're an athlete, like noticing that about yourself or getting feedback from people saying that you haven't been quite yourself, it's worth looking at. And so a lot of times that just happens, again, when we're talking about folks who've been playing their sport maybe since, I don't know, being a small child, and then they go all the way through to, college and beyond. That's a lot of years of having something be a part of your life, and also having to sacrifice a lot around, becoming great at your sport. That's always the goal, and that's one of the pieces of an athletic identity that we find probably in all, if not most, athletes. In that we want to win, you want to be
Yeah.
the best, be known as the person that gave their all, and sometimes that comes with so much sacrifice to the point where people don't recognize the shifting around, the negative things that maybe come from that. By when you're overly sacrificing, there's usually some things you're going to miss out on in experience, right? So if I'm an athlete and we have a game on a Friday night as a high school football team, I'm probably missing going out to the movies with friends or being able to have some of those like life experiences there, and you do see a sense sometimes in athletes later around resentment around that, or if
Oh, wow.
somebody suffers a career-ending injury. It's sort of like, well, what was the point? I gave up all those years, of my life for what? And so I think they're wrong when they think that, in the sense of like that it wasn't for anything. But that's, again, something to work through and to really process, because their identity has shifted now. It's not at the forefront as much because of an injury or because of, a shifting in interest. And so I think being able to open conversations around that is important, and having current athletes talk with former athletes about what does that look like is always a helpful place, I feel like, to start. And so we try to do that a lot, because it changes so quickly. You can change from game to game, something happening, and being able to then have to totally shift how you navigate this world.
Yeah, we talk to my son all the time about, you got to flush the bad play and move on to the next one, live for the next pitch when we're talking about baseball. And, when I think about the last year that we've all experienced as a world, with the shifts and the changes and the balance maybe that's been created due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm curious, based on what you've seen, what have been some of those challenges that you've seen student athletes have to face as it relates to managing the changes from protocols associated with COVID-19 and, fans not being in the stands? Overall, it's been a big change even for parents and for fans. But what's it been like for the student athletes that you work with?
Yeah, it's definitely been a huge shift and change. So everything that you mentioned, like the protocol changes for sure have been huge, and even the amount of testing that they have to do, like COVID testing, just to make sure that we're playing safely and not, contaminating another team or each other. And so just the process of that now having to be worked into already busy schedules. And so, many of my teams here get tested multiple times a week, especially when they're in season, just because it can change from day to day. And so, of course, that's made a huge impact and change. And then you do see the difference in the fan experience and having those fans there for sure. I've been particularly in the PMAC for LSU for basketball, for women's basketball in particular. It's interesting there's fans there, but we also, just to make it have that same loud roar, because we call the PMAC the Death Dome. I know you know that,
Yes.
but to know that it doesn't sound too deathly, it's not as many people in there, and that can totally impact the players, like, sort of the feeling that you get, the roar that you hear when you're running out of the tunnel and that sort of thing. And so it's been interesting to even see how schools have navigated that. I've seen a lot of schools actually have to do that, using like sound and noise machines of fake fan noise, just to sort of give that energy there, because some of our athletes do thrive off of that. There's an adrenaline rush that comes with that. And so it has been really interesting to watch, but I will say, these kids are resilient. Like, they have definitely, hung in there. They've made the adjustments around testing protocols. They've adjusted to, scheduling changes now. A lot of ways that some of our sports were played where, you might play home one day and then 3 days later you're headed on the road. A lot of schools and conferences in general, like the SEC, has done a lot of sort of clustered games where, if you're playing a team, then they're going to come in and you're going to play them twice and get both of the plays that you would normally have spread out over a season done at one time. And so just to keep people safe, which I think ultimately our athletes appreciate, but I can also, speak to the fact that I know that's been harder for many of them, just knowing that, instead of having a break between games, you're playing 2 days in a row in more of a series, which wouldn't typically happen in sports that don't do that, like volleyball. They've done that a lot this year. They've split their season. Our indoor volleyball team is still in season, and they're supposed to end in like November. So they're still in March. So there's a lot of overlap between now them and some of our other spring sports that are starting up, and that's hard with scheduling, and they still are in school. Like that's the other piece there. Like a lot of people forget about that, but they're still taking classes, finding out what their careers might be post sport, and working through that stuff. Some of them are working towards graduation, so there's a lot there to think about. And COVID definitely, I think, brought about a lot of changes. But I think they've handled it really well. It's pushed those of us who work in the mental health field to get more creative in how we do things, offering virtual counseling, being more present at teams, entering testing protocols. Myself, I've been tested more times than I can count.
Oh my gosh.
Which is okay with me, but it's a lot. Like it changes a lot from day to day. So they've handled it really well. This generation of kids will have great stories to tell their kids about this time in their life, because they definitely have seen a lot in what's been now we can look back and maybe say a short period of time since we're approaching a year, but it's been a lot.
It has. And this generation, as we like to say, they're going to display something, all of them, which is grit, and in how they've persevered through, this unprecedented time in history. And it's amazing. Yep. I mean, it really is. I mean, I'm a known athletic supporter of LSU, all sports, always have been, even since I was a student. And it makes me feel good as an athletic supporter to know that a resource exists on our campus, knowing how important I know, and I value mental health, how awesome it is that there is a resource on campus for our student athletes and the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And like you said, this is not necessarily a widely existing department that is available at all universities. And so, I mean, I'm curious to know, a little bit more about what led you to athletic mental health and to the point where you're at today as the director of student athlete mental health for LSU.
Yeah, it definitely was an unplanned journey in some ways. I've always been passionate about working with college age students, just in general. So when in my clinical training and all that stuff that I worked at, actually did one of my internships at LSU's counseling center on campus, the main counseling center, and I fell in love with it there, and just have taken on some other like clinical internships and opportunities and practicums, and just kind of drifted this way. And so I initially started out working, doing mental health, particularly for marginalized student groups, students of color, and many of those students that would come to us over in multicultural affairs at LSU were athletes. And so just in getting to work with some of them and hear the stories, and being able to recognize that there is this extra layer, like we were talking about earlier, of that athletic identity that's put on top of everything else they have going on just as a regular college student, sparked my interest. And so I just still kind of hung out in multicultural affairs for a while. And then the opportunity came for me to come on as an assistant director over here in athletics. And I took that opportunity and was on the job for 6 months. And then the director left and he was leaving. And so that was an unexpected change, but definitely one that I was excited about. I felt like it was fate after all that time of having worked with athletes indirectly to now get to reshape our program and really rebrand it. Because at that time of coming in, there was still so much stigma and the services were being utilized, but we were really trying to push out the fact that we were here and what we do and what we don't do. And over time, I just feel like that has become almost like second nature as a part of our larger department, where people know we're here and we're here to do a little bit of everything. So if it's mental health work you need, or if it's sport performance items, things like that, we are able to accommodate all of that, which again, a few years ago, I don't know that you could have asked most schools if they would have had anybody. And so for us to have come this far has been really, really amazing. And like I've said, as a former athlete, someone who was not brave enough to compete collegiately, that's where I stopped. I was like, that is it for me. I'm going to go into mental health instead. I have such an appreciation and respect for these students and their experiences, because they really, really experience a lot. They go through a lot, but they also work really, really hard. And so I've just fallen in love with this work, and it's been really, really great. I don't know that I'll ever really do anything else and veer away from this sort of intersection between mental health and sport, because I love sport so much. And it's played a huge part in I think my life as a former athlete. I know we love the word grit on this show for sure, and being able to know that the grit that I feel like I've developed as a person definitely was contributed to by my time as an athlete, as a young kid. And so I just love getting to show up to work every day to be a part of all of these students' stories. It's been amazing so far.
And whenever you can put 2 feet on the floor every morning and get up and have energy and, as you said, grit and passion for what you're doing every day, I mean, that's what all of us should be striving for. I know so many times, we do things because we have to, but there's a beauty in doing something that you love. And I mean, just hearing you talk about it, I can feel it certainly coming out of you. And as I always like to say, if you can't be an athlete, be an athletic supporter. From my favorite movie, Grease, on that one. Grease the movie. I'll never forget. One of the coaches said that in one of the on the movie. He said, if you can't be an athlete, be an athletic supporter. So I always really embraced my role as an athletic supporter since I couldn't get on the field and do much of anything myself. But Doc,
well, same
thing. Well, one of the questions that we ask every woman that we interview on the Gritiron Show, like I said, each one of you has at least one thing in common, and that is that you display grit in your life and in your role in your respective industry. But we're seeking to build a community. We want our listeners to learn about other women that you see that have grit or that you admire. So anyone come to mind that you would want to share that displays grit that you look up to?
Yeah, I definitely, and she'll probably be surprised by this because she'll be like, sport was not her thing at all. But when I think of her, I think of, my career in sport a lot. So Dr. Shonda Allen Mitchell, who was one of my supervisors here at LSU when I first started working in multicultural affairs, and just a wonderful person, particularly as a woman of color who was very instrumental in me pursuing whatever I wanted. He was one of those people that just, made sure that I knew that I could do anything that I wanted to do, no matter what that was. And she was always the person as I was in grad school and even after getting my first role full time, she was just like, okay, LaKeitha, what do you want to do? And she never let up off of that. And so I've seen her journey career-wise. She's, done phenomenal things both here for LSU. She works for the governor's office now. And I just have seen the impact that she's had on so many prior students and then now colleagues for sure, both across, our state, but across the country. And so she is someone who I admire greatly because I just really, really value her input and her opinion, but also the passion that she's had for the work that she's done in every setting that she's been in. And so, again, whether or not she ever thinks that she's contributed to my role as someone working in sports, she'd probably be very surprised to hear that. But she has in so many ways, and I value and appreciate her so much as one of the first folks that really, really took me in as someone moving to Baton Rouge when I first got here 11 years ago. I definitely did not have my bearings. I'm a New Orleans kid, so it's a little moving from there to here, and so she just was phenomenal and a part of that journey. And I just know so many other people connected to the LSU community and beyond that love her. And so I really just value and appreciate her.
Dr. Shonda Allen, she gave me an opportunity to be a Spring Fest leader when I was a junior at LSU for Spring Fest. So absolutely a woman with grit and who continues to break glass ceilings everywhere that she goes and provide opportunities for others to follow her. I mean, trailblazers is the word that comes to mind there. Dr. LaKeitha Poole, Director of Student Athlete Mental Health at LSU Athletics and Sports Performance Small Talk Counseling and Consulting. Thank you so much for saying yes and joining us on the Gritiron Show to share a little bit more with our listeners about you and your story and also about the importance of mental health for our student athletes. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Definitely my pleasure. Wonderful show. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.